I want to introduce our speaker tonight, Dr. Anna Womack, who's very kindly sharing her expertise with us. She's a licensed psychologist specializing in the treatment of insomnia, anxiety, and related concerns. She's based out of the Manhattan Center for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. So Dr. Womack, welcome, and I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. So as Clara mentioned, my name's Dr. Anna Womack. I am a licensed psychologist here in the state of New York, working at a private practice called the Manhattan Center for Cognitive Behavioral Therapy. And as Clara mentioned there, I do a lot of work with anxiety-related disorders. And I also do a fair amount of work with insomnia, which is, of course, what I'm here to chat with you guys about tonight. Before we jump into our presentation for today, I just want to quickly say that I know these are incredibly unusual times that we're living in, and I sincerely hope that everybody's able to stay safe and healthy. And hopefully we can talk about some things to help improve upon sleep, because in these circumstances, sleep can get really disrupted when our schedules get really disrupted, as they have been. So let's see. There we go. Okay. So I just want to offer some additional recommendations to help everybody get the most out of today's presentation. Again, I'm just going to reiterate what Clara mentioned about making sure to stay muted. If you want to have your video on, I suppose that's fine. Whatever you prefer to do works, just as long as we're eliminating as much background noise as possible. As Clara also mentioned, I'm going to encourage everybody to ask questions. There's likely something that you were hoping to get from today's presentation. And so if I don't address it, I want to make sure you have the opportunity to ask that question. So make sure to do that using the chat function, the email, or on the Facebook Live comments to ask those questions. As Clara mentioned, I'll address those at the end, but feel free to put those in the chat whenever those questions come up. I'll also encourage everybody to take notes if possible. We're going to cover a lot of information today. And one of the best ways to help solidify and retain that information is to write some stuff down. So if you want to take a moment to grab some pencil and paper, now would be a good time to do that. I'm also going to encourage everybody to, because as I mentioned, we're going to talk about a lot of stuff. So I'm going to encourage everybody to look for one major takeaway or skill that you can practice after today's presentation. There's going to be a lot of suggestions that I'm going to offer, a lot of pieces of information. So I would encourage everybody to just try to keep a lookout for one thing that would be helpful for you to work on, or encourage a family member or friend to work on after today's presentation. It may be information you want to share or a skill. So I'm going to encourage everybody to keep an eye out for that. So some of you may be able to relate to this picture here, or you may know folks who could really relate to this picture. A lot of times folks find that they lay down to go to sleep and they're looking forward to falling asleep, only to find that their mind has a lot of difficulty shutting down or turning off from the day. And so they may lay in bed thinking, I am determined to go to sleep now. So some of you may be able to relate to this. Others of you may have the experience where you lay down and you're able to fall asleep pretty quickly, but you wake up frequently throughout the night. And that's another kind of related insomnia sleep disruption that we'll talk about a little bit more. Regardless of what your experience is, again, I hope we're going to be able to share some information that can help you improve upon any kinds of disrupted sleep experiences you are having or a friend or family member may be experiencing. So first of all, we're going to talk about a couple different things. Number one, we're going to talk about understanding sleep. I'm going to give you some information about what sleep is, what causes sleep, healthy sleep, unhealthy, disrupted sleep. And then we'll talk a little bit about if you have the experience of disrupted sleep that I'll offer some recommendations for improving upon that. But we'll start with understanding sleep. So there appears to be an arrow and a line on the slides that I didn't intend to put there. So if that's disruptive to you, if you can see this arrow or this line here, that doesn't mean anything. I'm not really sure where that has come from. So sorry about that. So we're going to start off by looking at the stages of sleep. So when we sleep, we move through multiple different types of stages. The first stage of sleep is the lightest stage of sleep, where people are easily awakened. And if you've ever had that experience of sort of nodding off and then jerking awake, that is stage 1 of sleep. Stage 2 of sleep is when eye movements stop and brain waves really begin to slow down. And then stages 3 and 4 is that deeper sleep where brain waves are interspersed in smaller, faster waves. These delta brain waves are the type of waves that we engage in deep sleep. And then finally, stage 5, REM, or rapid eye movement sleep, is something that's commonly talked about with regards to stages of sleep, because that's the stage that's associated with dreaming. So moving through all 5 of these stages is considered a cycle of sleep, and a healthy sleeper will cycle through these stages multiple times throughout the night. So that's what sleep looks like. But what causes sleep? I think that this is important information to cover, because if we understand what causes or prompts sleep, then if we're having difficulty with sleep, we can turn to some of these natural mechanisms to help support a return to healthy sleep if we're experiencing disrupted sleep. So currently, it's thought that there are 2 mechanisms at play that really cause sleep. So the first one that I'll talk about is the circadian rhythm. And so you can think about this as sort of like your natural body clock, because the circadian rhythm is that natural internal system that's designed to regulate feelings of sleeplessness or sleepiness and wakefulness over a 24-hour period of time. And so the way that this system operates is based on light signals that our brain receives during the day. So what happens with this system is light signals travel through our optic nerves to a specialized location in our brain called the suprachiasmatic nucleus. And that's basically just a group of cells that exist in a part of our brain called the hypothalamus. And so when this light signal travels through our optic nerve into the suprachiasmatic nucleus, or the SCN for short, that indicates to us that it's time to be awake. And so other signals are sent throughout our body saying, hey, it's time to be alert. It's time for us to try to feel awake. But when there's signals sent through our optic nerves that indicate that it's dark outside, then our body responds by saying, okay, it's time for me to release melatonin, which is the sleep hormone that causes us to feel tired. And so in a healthy sleeper, this pattern exists and helps us feel tired sort of in the same cycle of day and night. And this can be really commonly disrupted by things like staying up late into the night with things like lights or watching TV, or sometimes if you're a person who works in the evenings, trying to shift to being awake in the evening and asleep during the day can be really difficult. So that's one mechanism at play here that causes sleep. Now, the other mechanism that's at play is what's called the sleep-wake homeostasis. And a really good way to think about this mechanism is similar to hunger. So as we go throughout the day, our hunger level, or our desire for food, increases. And then once we eat something, we respond to that desire for hunger. That hunger drive or desire for food decreases, and then it begins to steadily increase throughout the day from there. So this mechanism, the sleep-wake homeostasis, operates in a really similar fashion. So as we move throughout the day, our sleep hunger or our drive and desire for sleep slowly increases. Doing things like staying active, being really engaged can help increase that sleep drive. So it hopefully coincides with our circadian rhythm, and at our bedtime at night, we're at the highest point of sleep drive and we're able to fall asleep pretty easily. Now, this system can also get disrupted pretty quickly by doing things like taking naps during the day. Because if we take a nap, then we're addressing that sleep hunger earlier in the day than we want to. And so then when we try to build that sleep desire up from there, it takes longer to get to that high peak where we're ready to go to sleep for the evening. So those are the mechanisms at play that when operating sort of naturally can help promote or cause sleep. One of the common questions that I get is, how much sleep do I actually need? I wonder if I'm sleeping too much or maybe not getting enough sleep. And so what you see here are the recommendations from the National Sleep Foundation, which is a wonderful resource. You see the website for them as well as sleep.org at the bottom of this graph here. Wonderful resources where you can get a lot of information about sleep. But one of the things that I think is important to take away from this particular graph is that our sleep needs change over the course of our lifespan. So, of course, a newborn is going to have different sleep recommendations than an adult. And you even see different sleep recommendations for a teenager, so a 14 to 17-year-old, as compared to an adult. That teenagers need more sleep. So another important thing to mention about this graph is that these are just ranges. The actual sleep needs of an individual person vary a lot. And so it's important to look at this as just a range, not to say that, okay, I fit into the category of an adult, so I need to be right in the middle of that 7 to 9 hours. I need 8 hours. That's not the case. We just want to be somewhere in that range, with it commonly, folks commonly falling into that 7 to 9 hour range, but may needing as little as 6 or as high as 10 hours of sleep per night. And again, this is all based on healthy sleepers, typical sleepers. So as I mentioned, to this point, we've been looking at patterns of healthy sleep. And so it's important to also look at what can cause these healthy sleep patterns to get disrupted, or what may cause sleep problems. And so you see a list of things that can impact sleep here. Things like sleep disorders. Of course, we associate that with sleep problems. And that can include things like restless leg syndrome or sleep apnea. And of course can cause disruption in sleep. But there's also other factors that can really influence this, like physical factors like pain or medical illness. If you're experiencing a high degree of pain, it's going to be difficult to go to sleep, even if you're trying to keep in the natural circadian rhythm. If you're experiencing pain, that's going to draw your attention and it's going to be difficult to fall asleep. Other factors that can disrupt sleep include things like behavioral factors, like lack of exercise or maybe not being very active during the day, or work schedule, as I mentioned before, like having a work schedule that requires you to work in the evening. Some other factors include things like cognitive factors, like psychological stress or mental health disorders. And so we'll talk a little bit more about those factors specifically, but I think it's important to look at different areas to consider what are some of these factors that might be contributing to my sleep difficulty. And so if somebody is experiencing recurring or ongoing sleep problems, they may be experiencing what we call insomnia. And so broadly speaking, insomnia is this dissatisfaction with sleep quantity or quality. And then in order for this to be sort of considered clinical insomnia, that dissatisfaction will persist for 3 or more days out of the week for a time period of at least 3 months, despite the adequate opportunity for sleep. So if you're experiencing that dissatisfaction in that sort of continuous way, despite having the appropriate amount of time and opportunity to sleep, it may fall in line with insomnia. So some other symptoms of this can include things like difficulty falling asleep, difficulty maintaining sleep, getting up earlier in the morning than you want to, and not being able to go back to sleep. And an important thing to note with insomnia is that it can really significantly impair one's ability to function in important life areas. Like, for example, in your relationships, if you're not getting enough sleep and you're feeling really irritable and that's negatively impacting your relationship with others, then it's significantly impairing an ability to function in an important life area. So even if you don't meet all of these criteria that I just listed or mentioned, you can still experience pretty significant disrupted sleep patterns that may be intrusive in your life. So that's what insomnia can look like. But I think just like it's helpful to understand what healthy sleep looks like, what causes healthy sleep, it's important to look at theories behind what causes insomnia. And so the predominant theory about what causes insomnia is this 3P model of insomnia, where the 3Ps refer to different factors that influence our experience of insomnia. So the first factor are predisposing factors, and these are things like biological characteristics or genetics. So an example of a predisposing factor is being a woman. Women are statistically more likely to have sleep difficulties. Another example of this is folks who experience anxiety. So if you are somebody who experiences any type of anxiety, generalized anxiety, social anxiety, that might be a predisposing factor for insomnia. Now, this doesn't necessarily mean if you have any of these predisposing factors that it automatically equals having insomnia, but it just means that folks who have these factors are at greater risk for developing insomnia. Now, the second category of factors that's important to look at are precipitating factors. And so these are major life events that happen, big changes, things like starting a new job or moving or I don't know, a global pandemic, something that's a major life event that can influence your sleep patterns. A really good example of this is having a newborn baby. So if you bring a newborn into your home, of course, that's a major life event that's going to influence your sleep. And make it difficult to continue in some of those same patterns. And so what we tend to see here is a combination of predisposing and precipitating factors leads to acute insomnia. So that can be sort of short-term insomnia until the precipitating factor sort of resolves. And then it may go under that insomnia threshold and somebody may return to normal patterns of sleep. Like in the example I gave earlier, when the newborn starts to sleep through the night and on a regular schedule. But then we can develop in chronic insomnia when we engage with some of these perpetuating factors or the psychological or behavioral patterns of sleep that develop over time. So once we develop some of these perpetuating factors, it tends to maintain our sleep difficulty. And so once we're in that point, we see that folks tend to develop chronic insomnia. So an example of a perpetuating factor is something that disrupts those healthy sleep patterns that I mentioned before, like taking naps during the day, for example. So that's what can lead to insomnia. I think it's helpful to have some background information about what can lead to that, so you can keep an eye out for those perpetuating factors, and try to resolve those early on if possible. I think it's also helpful to recognize these 3 Ps, because some of you may be in an experience right now where you're involved with a precipitating factor and you're experiencing acute insomnia. And so I think it's a helpful reminder to say that, hey, once this major life change sort of resolves, it's likely that my sleep will return to the pattern that it was in before, as long as I watch out for engagement in some of these perpetuating factors. So as I mentioned just a little bit ago, one of the factors that can cause sleep problems is psychological stress and psychological disorders. So this is important because there is such a close relationship between insomnia and mental health. So a lot of the time we see that insomnia is a common symptom of many different mental health concerns. So oftentimes I hear complaints of disrupted or difficulty sleeping, with anxiety, as I mentioned earlier, often seen with depression, where people may be sleeping more than normal and disrupting some of those natural sleep cycles. Also with bipolar disorder, substance use, just really a myriad of different mental health concerns have insomnia as part of a symptom of that. It's also difficult because not only can insomnia be a symptom of mental health concerns, but it can also be, mental health concerns can be exacerbated by the existence of insomnia. So having insomnia or disrupted sleep can make it really difficult to focus or sustain attention. It can also feed into somebody feeling really irritable, which may relate back to some mental health concerns and sort of exacerbate some of that. Also adding to the complexity of this sort of relationship is the potential for psychotropic medications. So for some folks who take various medications, that can also influence sleep. A common side effect of a lot of medications is drowsiness. And so you may feel more tired than normal due to the medication that you're taking. So it can be, insomnia and mental health concerns can be a little bit of a sort of a chicken or egg situation, meaning it's difficult to know maybe which one came first or which one is strongest, because they just really overlap and connect a lot. One of the things that I think is important to look at in this relationship is that insomnia can really disrupt the effectiveness of mental health treatment. So if you or a loved one is engaged in mental health treatment and having sleep problems and not seeing a lot of improvement from the treatment that you're receiving, it may come back to the insomnia or the disrupted sleep that you're experiencing. Because as I mentioned, a side effect of insomnia is difficulty focusing. If you're having difficulty focusing on treatment or therapy, it's going to be really difficult to retain that information and apply it in later situations. So what I tend to recommend for the folks that I work with and for others who may be seeking treatment is to try to address sleep concerns first. If you are experiencing disrupted sleep and insomnia, you don't have to get it to a place where your sleep patterns are perfect by any means, but just addressing them to help them improve, so you can really attend to some of the information offered in therapy and treatment, can be really helpful and just really set you or a loved one up for success. with the treatment. So the primary takeaway here is that sleep is so important for mental health and mental wellness. And so if you are experiencing sleep concerns in combination with a mental health concern or disorder, I would strongly encourage you to keep an ear out for some of the recommendations we'll talk about in just a second, to see what maybe can be helpful in applying as you move forward, looking for that one skill to practice. So, as I mentioned, it's super important to try to maintain healthy sleep as much as possible. So for those of you who might have disrupted sleep, or supporting someone or living with someone who has disrupted sleep, that really begs the question, well, what can I do? What do I do to improve my sleep difficulties if I'm experiencing them? So we're going to talk about that now. I'm going to offer a lot of different suggestions for ways to address some of these difficulties. So if you're still keeping an eye out for that one helpful takeaway that you want to remember after today's presentation, this is a really good opportunity to look for a skill to practice or a helpful takeaway. So before we get into the helpful things to do, it's important to recognize some of the things that might be happening that are unhelpful. So I'm going to walk through each of these and talk briefly about why it's an unhelpful thing, and offer some recommendations about how to adjust. So not going to bed at the same time every night disrupts that circadian rhythm I was talking about. So if we go to bed at 2 a.m. one night, and then the next night we go to bed at midnight, then the next night we go to bed at 8 p.m. There's such a variation there, and that's really disrupting that natural system that's at play. So what we want to try to do is get on a regular routine. I'll talk more about a nighttime routine in a little bit, but one important piece of that routine is saying, okay, I'm going to set the reasonable goal of going to bed at blank time each night. And that, of course, is going to vary greatly depending on people's individual circumstances, what's reasonable. But setting that same time and going to bed at that same time each night, even on the weekends, is really important. So not just every night during the week, but the weekends as well, maintaining that same schedule. So something else that's really unhelpful is watching TV or looking at your phone when you're in the bed. That's a really common thing that a lot of us do, but actually it again feeds back into that circadian rhythm kind of thing, because we're getting that light input through our optic nerve. So it's signaling to our brain, hey, time to be awake. And that's absolutely what we don't want to be doing when we're in bed trying to go to sleep. Another thing with this point is that depending on what you're watching or what you're looking at on your phone, it can be really activating, meaning it can be really upsetting. It can be really, scary if you're watching a scary movie, or maybe listening to the news. And so feeling activated is also not going to help reinforce sleep. So going to bed when you're not sleepy is another unhelpful thing to do. This may feel a little contradictory to going to this bed at the same time every night, if you're not feeling tired at that time. But again, comes back to, it's really important to consider individual differences. But overall, we don't want to go to bed unless we're feeling tired, because our brain is such a powerful tool and makes associations so quickly. So if we get into a habit of going to bed when we're not feeling tired, our brain is going to associate the bed with being awake. And that is not an association we want to have. It's called learned sleeplessness, and we don't want that to happen. So another thing that's not super helpful related to the not sleepy thing, or going to bed when you're not sleepy, is laying in bed trying to force yourself to fall asleep. Like that picture I showed at the beginning of the person just laying there saying, I'm gonna go to sleep now. That's also not super helpful, because it's putting a lot of pressure on yourself. And again, thinking about, okay, I'm gonna go to sleep now. I'm going to go to sleep now, is really keeping your mind active and engaged. And we want to do what we can to sort of calm the mind in order to get to sleep. Napping during the day is something that I see so frequently, and it is really disruptive to sleep patterns because, like I said earlier, it disrupts that sleep-wake homeostasis by decreasing our sleep drive earlier in the day than we want to. And so when it gets to be typical bedtime, then we're probably not feeling as tired because we took a nap during the day. Drinking alcohol to get to sleep, also not super helpful. Alcohol is sedating, so you may find that you are able to fall asleep after drinking alcohol, but the sleep that you're getting is not good quality sleep. And instead, what's happening is your body's beginning to metabolize the alcohol while you're asleep, which can cause you to wake up pretty frequently throughout the night. And then lastly, this is probably pretty straightforward, but not getting enough sleep can be considered, of course, a poor sleep habit. And again, I would encourage folks to sort of reference that helpful range given your age range to consider what's enough sleep. Am I getting at that minimum? So some habits that can be helpful to engage in during the day. We'll talk about habits during the day, habits at night as well. But during the day, what we want to do to help promote healthy sleep is be engaged and active. So this will mean not just, sitting around watching TV a lot or napping, of course, during the day, but even if you're tired, getting up in the morning and saying, okay, I'm going to do something active. That can be, exercise, which we'll talk about a little bit more, recommendations there. But it can be, keeping your mind active. So doing something that's engaging for your mind as well. Again, we want to try to use those natural mechanisms that I mentioned in the beginning to our advantage. And so again, with a circadian rhythm, when we get that signal into our optic nerves that it's light out, that just naturally promotes wakefulness. And so if you struggle to get up in the morning and you're feeling really tired and groggy, it's helpful to expose yourself to sunlight. And it can be going outside for a short walk with a mask on, of course, and all safety procedures in place. Or it can be sitting by a window and letting some of that natural light come into your eyes. Or it can be, turning on a lot of lights in your house or your apartment, but just getting yourself exposed to as close to natural sunlight as you can. Also important to do things that can help improve your mood during the day, because that's going to help you feel engaged and active. So making sure that you're doing things that are enjoyable to you, maybe connecting with friends via FaceTime, or maybe reading a book, knitting, or whatever is enjoyable to you to help you stay engaged. We'll talk more about diet and exercise right now. So one of the recommendations or one of the things that can disrupt sleep, of course, is caffeine. It's something that a lot of people use in the morning to help them feel more alert, and it certainly does that. But if you're having caffeine late in the day, that can make it difficult to fall asleep. So again, this is another example of where things can really vary for people. And some people may be able to drink caffeine later into the evening and not have disrupted sleep. But if you are experiencing disrupted sleep, I would encourage you to think about limiting caffeine probably after, again, depending on when you would want to go to sleep, but probably after lunch, trying to limit the caffeine. Also avoiding alcohol before bedtime for the reasons that I mentioned, earlier. Excuse me. If you are going to have a glass of wine or a drink after work or before you with your meal, that's fine. I'm not saying you can't have alcohol at all. I'm just saying that having it 3-ish hours, or trying to limit that 3-ish hours before bedtime. Relatedly, you want to avoid big meals or spicy foods right before bed, because again, that can be pretty disruptive to your digestive system while you're trying to sleep, and cause you to wake up. And so again, I think it'll vary from person to person, but about 3-4 hours would be a good sort of window to try to aim for to eat a meal before bed. It can be helpful to minimize liquid intake before going to sleep, because again, if you're somebody who wakes up a lot during the night, having a big glass of water right before you go to sleep might work against you. So try to minimize that as much as possible. And then with regards to exercise, doing a combination of different types of exercise can be helpful. So doing some cardio exercise as much as just 10 minutes a day can really help be active and help you expend that energy. So you're increasing that sleep drive at night. Alternatively, or additionally, you could do some strength training exercises, things like sit-ups, lunges, push-ups, that sort of thing. That is another thing that keeps people or keeps activity levels up and keeps sleep drive increasing throughout the day. Also, yoga can be a really helpful, or stretching and balance types of exercises like yoga can be another helpful way to stay active. And we can also use some of these exercises as a way to facilitate sleep, which I'll talk about in a moment. So that's what a daytime routine can look like to be helpful, including those diet and exercise recommendations. But then when it comes to the nighttime, I also have some specific recommendations there. First of all, I mentioned this before, but so important to have a consistent sleep-wake schedule. If that is something that is varied for you, that is a great place to try to target and change. And putting yourself or encouraging a loved one or family member to develop that consistent sleep-wake time is just going to be really, really important in facilitating a good routine. Not only is it important to have that consistent sleep-wake time, but to have a typical bedtime routine, something that communicates to your body, hey, I'm doing the thing that I normally do before I try to go to bed. So hopefully this bedtime routine includes things like the calming, relaxing activities that help facilitate a ease into sleep rather than things that might be sort of activating, like watching the news or reading a scary book. A helpful thing with determining the bedtime might be going to bed earlier, especially if you think you're not getting enough sleep. So try to set that bedtime earlier than it has been. And I tend to recommend limiting the use of sleeping aids and sleeping pills. Those are fine to use pending appropriate prescriptions, or some of the over-the-counter things are fine to use in a limited fashion. But those are not really designed to be long-term kinds of aids, including things like melatonin supplements. It's really just sort of replacing this natural process in your body. So I try to encourage people to limit the use of sleeping aids and sleeping pills as much as possible. So that's a helpful nighttime routine, but the sleep environment, so your bedroom or wherever you may be going to sleep, is really important to have specific factors in play here. So again, I mentioned before turning off the TV and computer about an hour before bed. And that's again to try to limit the exposure to light, because that, again, that optic nerve feeds into that idea that, hey, it's supposed to be a time where I'm going to be alert and be awake. Relatedly, you don't want to read from a backlit device. So things like your computer or your iPhone may feed into that idea that, hey, it's time to be awake. We also want to make sure that not only are we limiting the amount of light in the bedroom environment, but we want to make sure that the bedroom is quiet, dark, and cool. These are the 3 factors that really can help promote sleep. And also want to only use the bed for a couple of things. Number 1, sleep, of course. And number 2, for intimacy or having sex. Again, if we use the bed for anything other than these things, it can really facilitate that learned sleeplessness. And we want the bed to only be associated with sleep. A helpful and challenging thing to do is to move bedroom clocks out of view. If you wake up frequently throughout the night, there's just this kind of urge to say, what time is it? How much longer do I have before I go to sleep or before I have to get up for the day? And so it's important to sort of eliminate that as much as possible by moving bedroom clocks out of view, or just sort of putting a covering over a clock if it's something that's by your bed. So I'm aware of our time, and I do want to make sure we have some time for questions. So I just have a few quick just a couple other quick recommendations to move through, and then I'll save some time for questions, and perhaps some of the questions will show up in these last few slides. So one of the things that I mentioned is, feeling activated when you're going to bed is really unhelpful for trying to facilitate sleep. So it can be important to do as part of your sleep routine or your bedtime routine to try to de-stress as much as possible. So doing things like aromatherapy, using lavender scents can be especially calming to help facilitate a sense of calm and relaxation. Soothing music, again, something that's facilitating calm or relaxation. Hot tea can do that same sort of thing. Also, it can be helpful to write in a journal if you're somebody who has a lot of racing thoughts as you lay down to go to sleep. It can be helpful to just sort of get some of those out in a journal before you go to bed, so you're not taking those with you to bed. A couple of, I mentioned earlier, yoga can be a helpful thing to do in order to help facilitate sleep, not just to facilitate activity and wakefulness. And what you see here are 3 different types of poses that can help facilitate sleep. So if you engage in one of these poses, the legs up the wall here on the top, lying butterfly in the middle, and then final resting pose on the bottom. If you mimic that and engage in some deep breathing patterns, focusing on your inhale and exhale, that can help de-stress and facilitate sleep. So even if you implement these really helpful strategies, you may find that you wake up during the night. So if that happens for you or for a loved one, the most important thing to do is to not panic. If you wake up during the night, that's okay. We want to try to facilitate relaxation. Making relaxation at that time our goal instead of sleep is really important. We don't want to put too much pressure on ourselves, like that first picture we saw where we're forcing sleep, but we're just trying to think about relaxing. And so relaxing can be doing a quiet, non-stimulating activity, and as best as possible, trying to postpone worrying. If you make some of these changes and you're still having sleep difficulties, it's important not to give up. These are some of the disrupted sleep patterns are easy to create, unfortunately, and a little bit more difficult to try to change. So if you continue to have sleep troubles, don't give up and say, well, I guess this is just going to be how it is. Some steps to take if you're still having trouble sleeping are to collect some data. Important things to take note of are things like when you go to sleep, when you wake up, how many times you wake up throughout the night, that sort of thing. It can be helpful to talk to to a doctor about some of these concerns, perhaps a primary care doctor or other professional that you may see. And you may decide to seek the assistance of a sleep specialist, which can help examine some of the sleep difficulty in more detail. So for more information, I mentioned several of these resources. You can go to the sleepfoundation.org, sleep.org. The CDC offers some recommendations around sleep and various resources. So if you're interested in more information, these are some great resources to check out. All right, and now we've got some time for questions. So I'm happy to answer any of those questions that may have come up in the chat.
Great. So I have been, hi everyone. I've been keeping an eye on those questions. There's some great ones. I think since we got, just to give everyone a sense of timing, we did get started a little bit after 6, So I think what we're going to do, if it's okay with you, Dr. Womack, is plan to have about 15 minutes for questions. So go until 7:10, and it'll be almost exactly an hour, and then we will say goodnight. So the first question, and then I think it came up a couple of times with different people's questions. There were several questions about increased anxiety because of this pandemic, and how is this sort of unprecedented situation and the sort of anxiety related to it. How can people sort of deal with that? One person mentioned specifically stopping the chatter in the head. How do you kind of get that chatter, bring that chatter down a little bit? One person mentioned panic attacks, like waking up in kind of a panic. So I think if we could start with addressing that, that would be great.
Sure. So first of all, if that's something that you're experiencing, this sort of increased anxiety in light of the coronavirus and the pandemic that we're experiencing, I think it's helpful to remember you are certainly not alone. I know that doesn't resolve the anxiety or change it. Excuse me, but it is a very, very common thing that we're hearing or that I'm hearing more of in my work. And so
can you just move the slide one back, since folks are still getting the resources?
Oh, sure. Oh, great idea.
Yeah.
There you go. So experiencing anxiety in a time like this is incredibly common. And one of the things that I think can be helpful for sort of quieting the chatter in your mind, either before you go to sleep or throughout the day, is to develop what I like to refer to as coping statements. And so these can be just quick, helpful reminders that you can turn to offer up sort of this mental reminder that, yes, this is a challenging time. Yes, there are a lot of things that are unknown about the future. And, I'm going to remind myself that I can't know what's going to happen. So I'm going to try to focus on the here and now, the today. And if you're trying to go to sleep, it can be helpful to sort of refocus your attention on a physical sensation, like your breathing patterns, to help give a little bit of separation from that internal experience or that sort of racing thoughts or chatter, and focusing on something that's more external and present moment focused. For somebody who may be experiencing panic attacks, like sort of waking up in a panic in the middle of the night, again, I would encourage you to, if that's happening for you, to wake up when that happens and waking up, to try to focus on your breathing and engage in those helpful coping statements to just sort of self-soothe as much as possible, and say, reminding yourself, like, I'm okay, it's okay, I'm in my bed, I'm trying to go to sleep. And then again, practicing a focus on your breathing are some quick things that I would recommend. If you have ongoing difficulty with some of those things, it can be helpful to reach out to maybe some of the resources that Clara has to share, some of the groups there, to continue to receive support in that fashion.
Awesome. We've had a couple of questions about the slides, so I just want to encourage folks Dr. Womack, you and I can figure out the best way to, if you're comfortable sharing the slides with participants. There's not really a way to send out, I see the question about sending the slides to everyone. There's not really a way to send it to just the people who participated in this, in the Zoom call. But if you email me, and I just put my email in the chat as well, I'm compiling a list of people who wanted the slides, and I'll send it out to that list. So, and we can figure that out, you know, after the fact. So just to go back to the questions, so we had a couple of questions about sort of sleep aids or milder sleep aids. There was a question if about melatonin and if melatonin has side effects. There was also a question about the difference between melatonin and glycine. And so I don't know if you want to address that quickly.
Sure. So I'm gonna start this with the caveat that my work as a psychologist is really more focused on sort of the behavioral and cognitive patterns, and less focused on some of the medications or sleep aids. So I would absolutely defer to a psychiatrist or a medical professional who has more expertise in that area. With all that being said, and that caveat there, I tend to recommend that people try to limit sleep aids and sleep medications as much as possible, because the side effect of those is that it just sort of disrupts that natural process that works really well. If we can get it working, you know, those mechanisms, the sleep-wake homeostasis and the circadian rhythm, working in a good fashion. So by giving yourself melatonin or other sleep aids, you're sort of sending the message to your brain that, like, hey, you don't need to do this job anymore because something else is doing this job. And those are really, really more intended for sort of temporary things, like when you're maybe experiencing some of the sorry, my computer had something to say about that. So when you're experiencing more of the precipitating kinds of factors, like the major life events, that can be something that can be helpful to help resolve maybe the experience of acute insomnia, but really isn't intended to help with chronic insomnia. So hopefully that answers the question. Yeah.
I think that's good. We had a couple of questions. These are some great questions. We had a couple of questions about dreams. A couple of people mentioned having really sort of having really lucid, realistic dreams. One person mentioned that they feel almost like hallucinations. And that can kind of cause more stress around getting to sleep from the fear of falling asleep and having these dreams. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, that is a really great question, and certainly something that I've heard from multiple people lately, with sort of the onset of this pandemic, that people have been experiencing more vivid dreams. So first of all, it seems to be that that's a pretty common experience. Doesn't necessarily resolve that to know that it's common, but sorry, I sort of lost my train of thought. So one thing about the dreams that I think is important to mention is, you know, there's so many different types of theories around why we dream. And so there's a lot of different explanations as to why we might be having these more sort of vivid dreams and experiences currently. But as far as the fear piece, which I think is really important to address, if you're having really vivid, upsetting dreams at night, and that's something that is sort of preventing you from going to sleep, or maybe making you feel apprehensive about that. I would encourage you to engage in, I'm really big on self-talk. And so I would encourage everybody to try to engage in sort of a soothing kind of dialogue before you go to sleep, to try to just help yourself feel as calm and de-stressed as possible before going to bed. And hopefully that'll help reduce some of the nightmares and help make it a little bit easier to fall back asleep if those do occur.
Awesome. There were also a couple of questions sort of circling around this idea of how do you balance not wanting to go to bed if you're not sleepy, as you mentioned, and while still trying to maintain that circadian rhythm and not going to bed too late.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really a great question. I'm so glad that that came up so I could talk a little bit more about it. So I do think, you know, it is a balance that we're trying to walk, of facilitating a regular sleep schedule and leaning into as much as possible that circadian rhythm. If you have disrupted sleep, I think the thing to try to prioritize is the schedule. So if you are noticing, and I'm just throwing out sort of arbitrary times, but if you are somebody who, you know, doesn't typically goes to bed at 2 a.m. and then gets up at, I don't know, 10 a.m., but you want to adjust that a little bit to fit more in line with your circadian rhythm, then you may start by getting up earlier. So even if it's difficult, you may push that back and in sort of an incremental fashion, and start by getting up at 9:30. And so you're having more time to feed into the sleep-wake homeostasis, and increase the sleep drive throughout the day. And so maybe you'll start to feel more tired, you know, 30 minutes earlier. So you're just sort of slowly shifting back, that sleep cycle and using the circadian rhythm to help reinforce it. So if you're waking up earlier, like at that 9:30 time that I mentioned, you want to try to quickly expose yourself to sunlight, and get that system, you know, enacted in your mind and in your body to say, hey, time to be awake. Let's start doing the things to be alert. And then if you're wanting to sort of shift that sleep time to be earlier, then you want to try to limit exposure to lights. It's difficult to do because, you know, we are all likely sitting in locations that are lit by artificial lights. But as best as possible, trying to limit that exposure can help adjust that. If that's something that you're wanting to, if anybody's listening to this and that's something that you're interested in doing with the support of a professional, CBTI, or cognitive behavioral therapy for insomnia, really does that. That's a big part of that type of therapy and work to help adjust some of those sleep patterns.
Awesome. Okay, I think we have time for one or two of the shorter questions. And I'm sorry, I know we're not going to get to everything. I'm trying to pick the questions that are kind of the most broadly applicable. Again, if you have follow-up questions, please feel free to email me, ckiley@naminyc.org, CKIELY. One person asked, why is looking at the alarm clock bad?
Ooh, okay, good question. So if you are looking at so what can happen for some people, if this isn't happening for you, you can disregard. But what happens for some people is they wake up in the night and they think, oh, what time is it? And then look at the clock and realize, oh, it's 3 o'clock. I have, you know, if I go back to sleep now, I have 6 hours to sleep. And then that sort of gets your mind activated and working, which can make it more difficult to fall back asleep after that time. So that's one reason why I discourage people from looking at the alarm clocks. Another reason that's pretty related to that is that looking at the alarm clock and realizing, you know, that process of like what time it is, just generally, even if you're not doing that mental math of how long can I sleep, can generally just make it more difficult to go back to sleep. Which if you wake up in the night, no matter what time it is, if it's not the time that you need to get up, you want to try to go back to sleep if possible. One of the major recommendations that I don't think I mentioned in this presentation is that if you wake up and you find it difficult to go back to sleep, you want to, and people really don't like this, but you want to get out of bed. If you can't go back to sleep after about 15 to 20 minutes, we want to get out of bed and do that sort of relaxing activity that can help facilitate sleep, a return to sleep. And the reason that we recommend that is because we really want to disrupt any association between being awake, especially at like 2 or 3 a.m. and being in bed. So we're trying to, by getting up out of bed, if you're not able to go back to sleep after about 15 or 20 minutes, you're really disrupting that learned sleeplessness pattern.
Awesome. One other sort of short question that maybe other people are wondering about, is there a difference between regular electric light and the blue light that you were talking about?
So, I mean, I think probably on a very detailed neurological level, there is some differences. And if you're having some sleep difficulty, I would just try to reduce exposure to light as much as possible, be it, sort of like the lights that are in lamps or light bulbs, as well as, sort of the blue light. If you're not able to eliminate some of that, I would really prioritize the blue light, because that can be particularly disruptive. And of course, it may not be feasible for us to walk around in a dark room or a dark home trying to facilitate sleep. So I would prioritize the blue light, limiting that, and then trying to keep the lights dim if not able to sort of eliminate altogether.
Awesome. All right, so we are past time, so I think we're going to end there. Again, I'm putting my email in the chat one last time. If you have any follow-up questions, I know a number of people have already emailed me about the slides. Thank you. We'll figure that out after the presentation. But thank you all so much for the great questions and for joining us for this really timely presentation. Thank you so much.
Yes, I just want to jump in quickly and also express my thanks, Clara, for inviting me to talk about this. I could talk about sleep for many hours, but I appreciate everybody's sustained attention for this 1 hour, and hope that everybody was able to walk away with something helpful for either themselves or others. But again, just thank you so much for inviting me.
All right, thank you. I think Dr. Womack and June, guess we can stay on for a second, and yeah, if you have any other questions, feel free to reach out. And check on NAMI-NYC.org for information about if you need additional support in this time. We can only get through this together. So that's what we're going to try to do. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a good night.
Thank you.